So it was the coup that 60 years ago overthrew the Fourth Republic in Brazil and heralded a new military dictatorship. In early April 1964, Marshal Castelo Branco became president, suspended the constitution and assumed full powers. 4 more military leaders followed in his footsteps before power was returned to the people through elections in 1985. It wasn't, though, until 27 years later that a truth commission was created to investigate the crimes of the dictatorship. That in 2012, under the presidency of Dilma Rousseff, herself brutally tortured by the regime.
Brazil deserves the truth. The new generations deserve the truth. And above all, everyone who lost their relatives and friends and who continue to live as if they were killed over and over again every day.
Well, the Commission's conclusions provided evidence of 434 deaths and disappearances. But during the 21 years of repression, it's believed more than 8,000 indigenous people were also killed and at least 20,000 people tortured. To this day, no one responsible has been convicted. In modern Brazil, the country still has those who are nostalgic for the period, notably on the extreme right, led by Jair Bolsonaro. Let's not forget that in January 2023, a week after the inauguration of the new left-wing president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Bolsonaro supporters, backed by high-ranking military officers, attempted to take back power by force. Lula himself banned official commemorations of 1964 this year. For many, the dictatorship remaining a dark period in Brazil's history. Well, Fanny Lathere, Valeria Saccone and Louise Rowley revisit Brazil 60 years after its coup for France 24.
São Paulo, Brazil's metropolis, Latin America's economic powerhouse. 60 years ago, this city was the epicentre of crimes and abuses committed during the military dictatorship. It was here, in this building, that at least 6,700 political prisoners were tortured. 50 of them are thought to have died. On March the 31st, hundreds of people gathered outside.
Esquecer nunca, lembrar sempre.
Their objective, 60 years on, to make sure that the horrors of the dictatorship are not forgotten.
Presidente Lula, o Estado nos deve isso para todas as cidadãs e cidadãos brasileiros. Nós merecemos que o governo se posicione.
This year, some of their anger is directed at Lula. He's cancelled the government's official memorial ceremonies. His aim? To calm tensions with the army and also with the far right of Jair Bolsonaro, accused of an attempted coup d'etat a few days after Lula's inauguration. It's a disappointment for Guida Amaral, who was arrested and tortured when she was just 18.
I voted for Lula, but I'm not going to follow everything he orders. I don't know why he decided this, but the incredible result is that it has lit a fire inside us. It's probably the biggest demonstration in recent years because everyone has disagreed with Lula's approach. All those who, like me, lived through the dictatorship, many of my generation.
The vast majority of participants in this march are survivors of the dictatorship. Many are political exiles who returned to Brazil during the transition to democracy. Like Maurício Polici, imprisoned at the start of the dictatorship, he now devotes his retirement to registering this dark period in history.
When you don't learn the lessons of the past, you run the risk of repeating it. Our organization believes that we need to know our past in order to understand the present, because the impunity of the past is the driving force behind the impunity of the present.
Unlike Chile and Argentina, Brazil is the only Latin American country not to have condemned its torturers. Years of dictatorship swept under the carpet. A symbol of this painful history, open to the public, is this building in the heart of São Paulo. The only place dedicated to preserving the memory of repression. It was once a prison. Maurício Polici has bitter memories.
This space was divided in two, and there were 4 cells that we're going to visit, and the solitary cell area was destroyed.
In 1970, as a young student, he was working for a left-wing opposition group when he was arrested and imprisoned for 4 years. He only spent a month here, but he remembers every moment, every sound.
The most disturbing sound here was this. When we heard that, we knew the door was opening for one of us to go upstairs to be interrogated and tortured.
His name is engraved on these walls, as is that of another prisoner.
There is a list of women who were imprisoned here, like Dilma, who was president of Brazil.
Former President Dilma Rousseff and Maurice were just 2 of some 20,000 people arrested between 1964 and 85. Now, campaigning for the preservation of political memory, he's desperate to pass these stories on to new generations. Every month, he organises a guided tour of Dokoji, a clandestine torture centre that served as a model for many others throughout the country.
This was the biggest room where they put the pau de arara,
a common instrument of torture at the time, used on dissidents and indigenous people. This, from a military parade, is the only known recording of its use.
When you were hung upside down, always naked, men and women alike, you have to bear that in mind. And when your body was tilted backwards, what came up? Your private parts, which are more exposed to electric shocks. So it really was an ordeal that was hard to resist.
Memories that are not brought to life in history books, stories that these young Brazilians are exploring for the first time.
Resistance fighters had discovered that the colonel-in-chief lived in a building in a nearby district that was reserved for the military. Someone said, "We're going to plant a bomb there." He got scared and moved here.
You read about it in books, but you don't get the details. It all seems so distant, as if it happened in the distant past. But it's only been 60 years. The military regime left many survivors who are still here and can tell us their story. We're privileged to still have witnesses from that time. I think that's very important.
For these survivors, that is a vital task. We meet up again with Guida Amaral, who's taking part in the visit.
And then I thought, if I don't survive the torture, I'll never be able to look at myself in the mirror again.
Since her return from political exile in France over 40 years ago, she's been waiting for reparations from the state.
There are 3 types of reparation: psychological reparation, monetary reparation, and moral reparation. I've had monetary reparation. That's a state obligation. Psychological reparation is very important. For 2 years, I took part in a state-paid clinic with psychologists. And finally, moral reparation. I haven't had that yet. And it's the most important, that the state formally apologizes.
It was only in 2012 that the government of Dilma Rousseff set up a commission to unearth the truth about the so-called years of lead. Among the members investigating the crimes committed during the dictatorship, this lawyer has heard hundreds of testimonies and collected piles of evidence.
As mortes aconteceram, não.
The deaths did not take place because a few torturers decided to do so of their own free will, for a sudden urge, or because they hated their victim. No, we are convinced, and this was written in our report, that torture was a state policy.
Isto ficou dito no relatório que isto foi uma política de Estado.
During the transition to democracy, an amnesty law was passed. It pardoned all political crimes, whether committed by the victims or their executioners. Despite the recommendations of the Commission, so far the Supreme Court has refused to review the law.
Mesmo a Dilma
Even Dilma Rousseff could have done more. But then she was impeached. Then we had Michel Temer, who was a fellow student at the time, but a conservative man who didn't want to deal with the subject. And then this person came to power who I consider to be a stain on our history, the most execrable person in the world, who is Bolsonaro.
When Jair Bolsonaro took office in 2019, all investigations linked to the military dictatorship were shelved. Like that of Edson Teles, head of the Forensic Archaeology Centre at São Paulo's Federal University.
We have 1,049 boxes corresponding to 1,049 bags of bones removed from the pit.
Carefully preserved here, all these bones come from a mass grave discovered in 1990 in a cemetery on the outskirts of São Paulo. It's the largest known grave from Brazil's years of dictatorship.
We reconstitute the person's skeleton on this table and try to identify the size, sex and age to see if it corresponds at least to the profile of one of the 42 missing persons from São Paulo's Doicodi that we are trying to identify. After that, we choose the bones from which we are going to remove fragments to collect the DNA.
So far, he's only identified 2 victims. The son of dissidents tortured at Doicodi, Edson Teles has made this the fight of his life. His family is the only one to have obtained an official state recognition that they were tortured by the head of the detention centre, Colonel Ustra, a man declared to be a national hero by Jair Bolsonaro.
It was horrible. I was so afraid, because even before he won the election, I received threats. And so did my family. His camp has its own version of the story that denies the reality of the facts. An army colonel came here and saw everything you're looking at. And he even said to me, "Consider yourself lucky that you don't have much more work to do, because we didn't kill that many. If we'd killed more, you'd have a lot more work."
A glorification of the past that is shared by a large part of the former president's support base. Now declared ineligible, Bolsonaro is travelling the country to campaign alongside other candidates from his party in local elections. Like here in the suburbs of Rio de Janeiro. Bolsonaro is a self-confessed fan of the years of military rule. Many of his supporters even deny that there was a dictatorship.
No, it wasn't a dictatorship. It was order and progress. It's written on the flag, right there. Order and progress.
During his 4 years in office, the former reserve captain appointed many military personnel to the government. He's also frequently paid tribute to the army. Ana Penido is a political scientist and specialist in defence issues. We asked her to analyse extracts from our archive filmed with Bolsonaro supporters. Right up until the election of Lula and the siege of Brasilia, January the 8th, 2023.
The values are the same, even if the reality now is different. But it's the idea of defending conservatism, good manners, the traditional family. We saw crowds marching for these values all over Brazil in 1964, just as we've seen these same crowds recently proclaiming the same values. The idea's been adapted, but it still works by mobilizing against a communist threat, that of an internal enemy.
O povo quer o exército nas ruas. O povo quer que o exército tome conta do Brasil.
The big question is, why do the Brazilian people love the army so much? Because the army's never been used to defend the country abroad. They've always been used for other kinds of missions, bringing water to remote communities, vaccines, ballot boxes, and also a presidential candidate. So in a way, it was foreseeable that the army would want to return and gain some form of political power.
Recently revealed was the involvement of high-ranking officers close to Bolsonaro in the attempted coup of January the 8th. But on the left, the focus is on putting out the fire. The Brazilian left has always had a difficult relationship with the armed forces, which it does not want to offend. In the wake of the 60th anniversary of the military coup, Lula has a chance to speak at a Workers' Party ceremony.
Nazism and fascism have returned with such force that we have to be prepared. Why must we prepare? To prepare ourselves to guarantee the survival of democracy.
There's little more than a vague reference to the recent turmoil. Backstage, for the party's leaders, the reason is simple. The far right still carries a threat.
We are not in a position of strength in Congress. If we try to challenge the opposition, they will seek revenge, try to overthrow us, or worse. So we're walking on eggshells. We have to deconstruct their discourse and reduce as much as possible the risks of a coup d'état and the return of fascist politics to power in Brazil.
At the beginning of April, the Ministry of Human Rights publicly acknowledged the violations of the rights of indigenous peoples during the military dictatorship. More than 8,000 of them were killed. It is a first collective reparation that could pave the way for many others in a country where some fear that if the past is allowed to be forgotten, it could be repeated.
Fanny Lotin, Valeria Sacconi and Louise Rowley revisiting Brazil 60 years after its coup. And that's all from this week's edition. You can catch it and the previous editions as well on our website. That's at france24.com. More news coming up in a moment. Thanks for watching.